The prison wall was 12 feet high. Armed guards patrolled every corner, their rifles gleaming under the South African moonlight. Winston Churchill pressed his back against the cold stone, his heart pounding so loud he was certain the entire compound could hear it. One wrong move, one snapped twig, one guard turning at the wrong moment, and he would be shot dead before sunrise. He was 25 years old, and this was either the night that would make him, or the night that would kill him. But to understand how Winston Churchill ended up climbing a prison wall in the middle of enemy territory, 300 miles from freedom with a price on his head and an entire nation hunting him, you need to go back 25 days. The armored train rattled through the hills of Natal, South Africa. Winston Churchill sat in one of the forward cars, a reporter's notebook in his hand, a revolver tucked into his belt. He wasn't supposed to be a soldier. He was a war correspondent for the Morning Post, sent to cover the Boer War for British readers back home. But Churchill had never been content to simply watch. The train carried British soldiers, Dublin Fusiliers and Durban Light Infantry, moving toward the front line. The landscape rolled by. Brown hills, scattered acacia trees. The endless veldt stretching toward the horizon. It was beautiful. It was also perfect ambush country. At 6:15 in the morning the trap was sprung. The first shell exploded against the locomotive. Then another. The screech of metal. The screams of men. Churchill was thrown against the wall of his compartment. As the train derailed, cars piling into each other in a chaos of twisted steel and shattered wood. The Boers had been waiting for them. Rifle fire erupted from the hillside. Bullets pinged against the armored plating. British soldiers scrambled for cover, returning fire, but they were exposed, sitting targets on a broken train in the middle of nowhere. Churchill did not hide. He jumped from the train and ran toward the locomotive. The engine was still working, but 3 derailed cars blocked the tracks ahead. If they could clear them, they could escape. If they couldn't, they would all die here. For the next hour, under constant rifle fire, Churchill organized the effort to push the derailed cars off the track. He shouted orders. He heaved against twisted metal with his bare hands. Bullets whizzed past his head. Men fell around him. He did not stop. Finally, the locomotive was free. It lurched forward, carrying the wounded to safety. But Churchill wasn't on it. He had stayed behind to help the soldiers still fighting. And when he turned to run, he found himself staring down the barrel of a Boer rifle. The man holding it was tall, bearded, dressed in the rough clothes of a farmer soldier. His eyes were cold. "Hands up," he said in accented English. "You are my prisoner." Churchill had no choice. He raised his hands. They marched him through the veldt, past the burning wreckage of the train, past the bodies of British soldiers. Other prisoners walked beside him, officers and enlisted men, all captured in the ambush. But Churchill was different. He was a civilian, a journalist, and that, he believed, would be his salvation. "I am a non-combatant," he told his captors, "a war correspondent. Under the rules of war you cannot hold me." The Boer officer who processed him at the States Model School, a converted prison in Pretoria, looked at him with something between amusement and contempt. "Mr. Churchill," he said, "we have reports. You were seen organizing the defense. You were armed. You are no innocent journalist. I never fired a shot. That is not what the men on the hill say." Churchill was escorted to a room with 60 other officers. The States Model School was a strange prison, a former schoolhouse with high walls and iron fences. Guards posted at every corner, comfortable enough but inescapable, or so the Boers believed. From his first night in captivity, Churchill began planning his escape. The days crawled by. Churchill paced the perimeter, studying the walls, the guards, their routine. He wrote letters to the Boer authorities demanding his release as a journalist. They were ignored. He wrote to friends in England, to newspapers, to anyone who might apply pressure. Nothing worked. 2 weeks into his captivity, he found his opportunity. 2 other officers, Captain Elmer Haldane and Sergeant Major Brocky, had been planning an escape of their own. They had identified a weak point, a section of the back wall where the guards' sightlines overlapped imperfectly. For a few minutes each night, when the sentries turned at the far ends of their patrols, a man could climb the wall unseen. Churchill demanded to join them. Haldane was reluctant. Churchill was too recognizable. His escape would make headlines. If he was caught, The Boers might tighten security for everyone else, but Churchill was relentless. He argued, he pleaded, he insisted. Finally, Haldane agreed. They would go on the night of December 12th. The night was warm, the sky overcast, no moon. Churchill waited in the shadows near the latrine, watching the guards, his heart hammered against his ribs. In his pocket he carried a few chocolate bars, 75 pounds in cash and a compass. That was all. No map, no contacts, no plan beyond getting over that wall. The first sentry turned, then the second. Now, Churchill moved. He crossed the yard in quick, silent steps, reached the wall, and began to climb. The iron fence at the top bit into his hands. He pulled himself up, balanced for a moment on the narrow ledge, and looked back. Haldane and Brocky were supposed to follow, but a guard had wandered into view. They were frozen, pressed against the shadows, unable to move. Churchill couldn't wait. Every second on this wall was a second closer to a bullet in his back. He dropped to the other side. For a long moment he crouched in the darkness, listening. No shouts, no shots. The guards hadn't seen him. He was out. But he was alone, and he was 300 miles from the nearest neutral territory, surrounded by an enemy nation that would very soon be hunting him with everything they had. Winston Churchill began to walk. By morning the Boers knew he was gone. The alarm went out across the Transvaal. Posters were printed, describing the escaped prisoner in precise detail. Young, red-haired, walks with a slight stoop, speaks no Dutch. A reward was offered, 25 pounds, dead or alive. Churchill saw the posters himself. He had walked through the night, following railway tracks east toward Portuguese East Africa, neutral territory. But by dawn he knew he couldn't continue in daylight. Every farmhouse was a potential trap. Every rider on the horizon could be a Boer patrol. He hid in a grove of trees and waited for nightfall. The second night he walked again. His chocolate was gone. His feet, the veldt stretched endlessly in every direction. Brown and hostile and utterly indifferent to his survival. He had covered perhaps 30 miles. 270 remained. By the third night he knew he couldn't make it alone. He needed help. He needed shelter. He needed, against all odds, to find someone in this enemy country who would not turn him in. He saw the lights of a coal mine in the distance. A desperate idea formed in his exhausted mind. He would knock on a stranger's door and bet his life on their answer. The manager's house stood apart from the mine works, a modest building with a light burning in the window. Churchill approached the door. His clothes were filthy. His face was gaunt. He looked exactly like what he was, a fugitive. He knocked. The door opened. A man stood there, middle-aged, with a weathered face and suspicious eyes. He looked Churchill up and down. "Who the hell are you?" Churchill took a breath. There was no point in lying. If this man was a Boer sympathizer, it was already over. "I am Winston Churchill. I have escaped from Pretoria. I need help." Silence. The man's expression didn't change. Churchill braced himself for a shout. A slammed door, a rifle appearing from behind the frame. Instead the man stepped aside. "Get inside," he said, quickly. His name was John Howard. He was English, a mine manager who had lived in the Transvaal for years, surrounded by Boers keeping his head down. He had no love for the war, but he had no love for the Boers either, and he had just made a decision that could get him killed. "The patrols have been through here twice already," Howard said, leading Churchill down into the mine. "They're searching everywhere. You can't stay in the house." He led Churchill deep into the coal mine past the machinery and the shafts, to a small chamber at the bottom. It was dark. It was damp. It smelled of coal dust and rats. "You'll stay here," Howard said. "I'll bring food and water. When the heat dies down we'll find a way to get you out." Churchill looked around the black pit that would be his home. "How long?" he asked. Howard's face was grim. "However long it takes." 3 days passed. Then 4. Then 5. Churchill sat in the darkness, alone with the rats and his thoughts. He could hear the mine workers above him, speaking in Afrikaans, unaware that the most wanted man in the Transvaal was hiding beneath their feet. Every footstep made him tense. Every voice made him reach for a rock, ready to fight if they came for him. But they never came. Howard visited when he could, bringing bread, meat, candles, whiskey. He brought news too. The search was intensifying. The Boers were furious. Churchill's escape had become an embarrassment, a propaganda disaster. They would not stop until they found him. On the 6th day, Howard came with a different kind of news. "There's a wool train leaving tomorrow night," he said, "heading to Lourenço Marques, in Portuguese territory. I've arranged for you to be hidden among the bales." Churchill's heart leapt. "You're certain?" "Nothing is certain, but it's your best chance." That night, Churchill climbed out of the mine for the first time in nearly a week. He was filthy, thin, and half mad from isolation, but he was alive. Howard handed him a pistol, just in case. They shook hands. "Thank you," Churchill said. "I will never forget this." Howard nodded. "Just don't get caught. They'll hang us both." Churchill was loaded into a freight car, buried beneath bales of wool, with only a small gap for air. The train lurched into motion. Every stop, every inspection, every voice outside the car made him freeze, barely breathing, waiting for the door to slide open and the rifles to point in. But the inspections never found him. The train rolled through the night, through the Transvaal, through the mountains, toward the coast. Churchill couldn't see anything. He could only listen to the rhythm of the wheels, to the shouts at stations, to his own heartbeat. Hours passed, then half a day, then more. Finally the train stopped. Churchill heard voices, but they weren't speaking Afrikaans. They were speaking Portuguese. He waited until the workers opened the car. He climbed out, blinking in the bright coastal sunlight, covered in wool fibers and coal dust. He was in Lourenço Marques. He was in neutral territory. He was free. Churchill walked to the British consulate, filthy and exhausted, and announced himself to the stunned officials inside. Within hours the news was flashing across telegraph wires to London, to Fleet Street, to every newspaper in the empire. Churchill escapes from Boers. The story was a sensation. The daring capture, the midnight climb, the 300 miles through enemy territory, the coal mine, the wool train. It was the stuff of adventure novels. And the hero was a 25-year-old journalist, who had talked his way into the war, and climbed his way out of prison. Churchill returned to South Africa, not as a correspondent, but as an officer. He was commissioned as a lieutenant, and fought in several more engagements, including the relief of Ladysmith. He was among the first British soldiers to enter Pretoria after its capture, and he made a point of visiting the state's model school. The guards who had watched him were gone. The walls he had climbed still stood. He stared at them for a long moment. Then he smiled. Churchill returned to England a celebrity. He was invited to give lectures about his escape, and crowds packed the halls to hear him. He published his account as a book, London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, and it became a bestseller. But he wanted more than fame. He wanted power. In the general election of 1900, Churchill ran for Parliament in Oldham, the same seat he had lost just a year before. This time, the escape preceded him. The voters who had rejected an unknown young man now embraced a national hero. He won by over 200 votes. Winston Churchill, at 25, was a member of Parliament. The escape from Pretoria became legend. It was told and retold, embellished and dramatized, the foundational myth of Churchill's career. Whenever he faced defeat, Gallipoli, the wilderness years, the dark days of 1940, he could point to that night in South Africa, and say, "I have escaped worse." John Howard, the mine manager who saved him, never sought recognition. He returned to his quiet life, among the coal and the machinery, but Churchill never forgot him. He sent letters, gifts, invitations. After the Boer War ended, he helped Howard's family. Some debts, Churchill believed, could never be fully repaid. In 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, when the bombs fell on London and invasion seemed imminent, Churchill addressed the nation with words of defiance and resolve. The boy who had climbed a prison wall had become the man who would not surrender. And somewhere in that voice, that growl of determination, that absolute refusal to accept defeat, you could still hear the echo of a 25-year-old fugitive walking through the darkness of the Transvaal, alone and hunted, betting everything on the belief that he would survive. Because that was Churchill, not just the statesman, not just the orator, but the man who, when every door seemed closed, would find a wall and climb it. 25 days from prisoner to hero, 300 miles from captivity to freedom. One moment of courage that launched a legend. That was the British Bulldog.